lesson this morning is that God is present with us through the Holy Spirit in good times and bad times.
He's always there with us. So I'm going to just expound on that, just like what I said, everything that we went through. The Lord has been with us this week and all the different stuff that we had to do. And one of the things, when they changed the telephone pole and they changed the angle of the telephone pole, that made the wires dip lower. Not only did it make the internet cable dip lower, and it made the telephone line dip lower, it made the power line dip lower. Praise the Lord, I didn't hit the power line. Okay? So the Lord's good all the times. Our key verse this morning is in Genesis 39:2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was prosperous man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So the Lord blessed Joseph wherever he was. So let us recognize this morning the dangers of favoritism. Okay? You would have thought that Jacob would have learned his lesson where his parents each showed favoritism to a special child. You would have thought that he would have learned his lesson, but didn't happen. And so Joseph himself became the favored person. So here this morning, you may have had to deal with the favored person. In other words, you might, maybe you weren't the princess. Maybe you were the ugly duckling. Okay? And you had to deal with that. Or maybe you're the ugly duck. Maybe you're the princess. So either way, Joseph had to deal with that his father. Joseph couldn't help that his father was favoring him. That he couldn't help that. So we need to be careful in our own lives that we allow destructive attitudes to be active. We don't want that in our own lives. So we need to recognize them and take measures to avoid trouble there. We need to ask God's help for peace and perspective when faced with trials. So trials are going to come. You're going to have things come up. That's always going to be something that will be around. And so ask God's help. Question number 2. Joseph's prophetic dreams. Joseph can't help that he dreamed dreams. God was speaking to him. Now, in this situation, in this family of Joseph, there was conflict. But every family has conflict of some kind. Everybody has drama of some kind. And if I go around the room and, without naming names and things, every one of us have drama. Every one of us have something that, when Beth and I got married, there was a guy that came through the receiving line at the very end. In fact, he was like, maybe it was a minute or two, but he was just hanging back, and then he went through the line. And when he went through the line, he was drunk as a skunk. He could hardly stand up. And so we shook hands with him, and he went down the stairs, and apparently he got some sandwiches. And so about 3 months after we were married, I asked Beth, I said, now, which one of your relatives was that? Because it wasn't one of my relatives. And she said, well, I was too embarrassed to ask you the same thing. It wasn't one of my relatives. Well, the night that we got married, it was raining. And in the Washburn church, in the back, the entrance is in the very back where the clock is. There's a place to hang your coats up that's like 8 by 10, and then it's right on the street. And apparently some guy just saw the lights on in the church, came in, and he went downstairs and got some sandwiches. And but every family has things that happen, good, bad, ugly. That's normal when people live together. All right, that there's always going to be conflict. Something is going to come up. That's normal. Now, most people move past the issues and they enjoy each other. Okay? Now, when you're sitting around at family reunions and things, you'll probably recall different things that people have done. Okay? But, we get past those things. They become fond memories. Unfortunately, some people allow the seeds of division to sprout. They allow that to become a bone of contention. They allow that to become an issue. They keep score. You messed up. You messed up. You messed up. Okay? And that's not a great thing to do. It happened in Jacob's family with his brother. And now Joseph was Rachel's firstborn, so she favored him. And, remember that he loved Rachel, thought he was marrying Rachel, and it ended up not being so. And so Leah, she had children like a rabbit, and her handmaids had children, and Rachel didn't. Rachel gave her handmaiden to Jacob, and she had children, but still Rachel was barren. And so when Rachel finally had a child, Jacob just loved him to pieces, and that set up this sibling rivalry. Now, remember that God's ways are not man's ways. We talked last week how that God had told Rachel that the older would serve the younger. We don't know why. God has a plan, and His ways are not our ways. And so even though His ways are not our ways, we still don't try to make things happen. God doesn't need our help. So Joseph took center stage, even though right now, at this one we're talking right this moment, he was the youngest. Now, I want you to remember that these boys and girl that were being born to Jacob, they are born in a 7-year period of time. So in 7 years, he has 11 children. Okay? Now, he has them by several different women, okay, but he still has 11 children. And here, the difference in age between the oldest, Reuben, and Joseph, the youngest, is 7 years. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Now the background of here, Laban deceived Jacob by substituting Leah in Rachel's place. Jacob had agreed to work for 7 years for Rachel's hand. He agreed to work another 7 years after he had discovered he had been tricked. And so over the next 7 years, Jacob had 10 sons by Leah, her handmaids, and Rachel's handmaids, and 1 daughter. Question number 4. Now, Jacob didn't learn from the favoritism in his own family, and he repeated it. Joseph had some dreams that would indicate his family would be under him. Obviously, they didn't take kindly to a young man's implications. Okay? Imagine this morning if RJ says, I had a dream, and my sisters are going to bow down to me. My sisters are going to do everything I tell them to do. Well, Lizzie might say yes, but Ariana's go, no way. So, RJ, if you have those dreams, keep them to yourself. Okay. Now, it didn't help matters either that Jacob used Joseph to spy on his brothers. Now, remember, there's only 7 years between them, but he is lording over them. And him spying on them even more, that caused them to even resent him more. So his father was favoring him, and now he's spying, and he's now reporting back that his brothers were doing stuff that they shouldn't have been doing. Okay, and the Bible in this situation, the Bible uses the word hate quite a bit in this situation, that they hated him even more. It was just plain too much for them when their father made Joseph a special coat. We call it a coat of many colors. It was a coat that had many pieces to it. Not just a couple pieces sewn, but it had a lot of pieces in different colors. A beautiful coat. Now, in its day, the coat that he was wearing was usually worn by the supervisor of a farm. Okay? So you can see where we're going with this, right? He makes him this special coat, and it's, even though he hasn't told them that he's in charge over his brothers, giving him this coat, they're getting furious. It was a constant reminder of their father's favoritism. They just couldn't run away from it fast and far enough. Now, they may have seen it also as a precursor to Joseph receiving the birthright. You know, the birthright was the lion's share of the inheritance, the family blessing, the Abrahamic blessing that came down to Isaac, came down to Jacob. Naturally, it should have gone to the firstborn, but we know that there's already in the second generation, Esau didn't get that blessing, and so it was still to be determined who was going to get that blessing. And they may have, you know how siblings talk, Dad favors Joseph, so he will probably get the lion's share of the inheritance. And in that day, the way the inheritance worked, the person that received the birthright, that received the inheritance from the father, they received 90% of the inheritance. And the other 10% was distributed to the rest of the family. That's going to get pretty small, isn't it? When you divide it among 10 boys, you've got Joseph would get 90%, and the other 10 boys would divide 1%, 10%. that's going to get, their portion keeps getting smaller and smaller. Now, what happened when they did that was, even though the person got the 90%, they then became the father figure, and they became responsible for the whole family. And they were supposed to take care of the whole family from the 90%. But being human nature, what it is, that didn't always happen. And so there was great resentment that happened there. We still know today that sometimes, because of inheritance, it will sometimes divide families today, won't it? Okay, Beth and I, we like watching mysteries, okay? And so sometimes, a lot of times in the mystery, the problem arises because the dad or the mom, they're going to leave everything to one of the children. And then someone gets killed. Okay, all right. It's a story. It's a mystery. But we know that those things today still cause problems. Question number 6. Now, the division over dreams. And we're looking down at verse number 5 for our scripture. In verse 5, he dreamt about sheaves, the wheat stalks. Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he said. So the sheaves of his brothers bowed down to him. And then in verse number 9, it's the same theme, just different elements, right? In verse number 9, he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Now when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in his mind. Jacob was familiar with dreams. The Lord had given Jacob several dreams. They all came to pass. They all happened. So when Jacob hears the dream of Joseph, now in this, Jacob didn't say it's not going to happen. We may think he said it's not going to happen, but he didn't say it's not going to happen. He asked the question, "Will your mother and I do that? Will we bow down before you?" He didn't say it's not going to happen. Okay? He's asking a question. So at that time, people believed that dreams were divine communication and they were prophetic, that it was God trying to speak to them. Now, that is sometimes true. God will sometimes give us a dream, and it can be a warning of something's going to happen. The problem here is that Joseph should have really kept them to himself. Okay? So, if the Lord gives you a dream or something, that, use wisdom, who you share it with, and be careful about that. Now, sometimes your dream is just you had too much pizza the night before, okay? All right. Question number 7. Joseph, not only the favored son, but prophesying about his future. Okay, so we got this complicated stuff that's going on. They couldn't stand the thought of Joseph ruling over them. Now, some people, they have problem with authority, period. It wouldn't matter who was going to rule over them. Some people have problem with every authority, and every person that appears to be an authority over them, they give them a hard time. They give their parents a hard time. They give their grandparents a hard time. They go to the store. They give the clerk a hard time. They go to school. They give their teachers a hard time. If they have brothers and sisters, they give them a hard time. Some people just have a hard time dealing with authority. We may ask, Joseph, why make things worse for yourself? This is a legitimate question for us to ask ourselves today sometimes. There are times that after we open our mouth and say something, we wish that we had just said nothing. Okay. Wisdom. Now, he's only a teenager. Okay? He's just a teenager when this happens. Now, when he gets the main thrust of our story this morning, he's 17 when he's sold into slavery to the Midians as the caravan's going by. He's only 17. And you know that 17, we read sometimes of 17-year-olds making stupid choices, right? You know, they go, well, didn't you know that oh, I don't know. But, you know, in psychology, they have discovered that a person's mental, total reasoning, understanding, it's not totally developed until a person is about 24. So you've still got some time after after you think you know it all. You've still got some time before your brain actually processes. If I jump off the barn, I could get hurt. Okay, still making not good choices. Now, Jacob rebuked him. He didn't say it wasn't going to be true. He just rebuked him. This was a way for him to tell him to cool your jets. Now, the brothers may have doubted that if it was going to come to pass. They may have doubted that. Jacob knew how divisive those dreams would be for his family. He knew his own family being divided. So Joseph may have been better served if he had simply kept silent. Now we have a record here of 2 dreams. He may have dreamed more. Okay? We may just have 2. He may have more. His choices and the results may prove guidance for us today. Maybe it's not a dream. Maybe it's wisdom. Maybe it's that you see. You might want to give somebody some gentle advice. So as you do that, be gentle with it. Use wisdom as you're given. Don't come across as okay, and don't ever say, I told you so. Don't go after they don't take your advice. Don't go back and say, I told you. I had someone years and years and years ago. They asked me if they should buy a car. And now I can tell you whether that car has a good record or not, gas mileage, repairs, reliability. I can tell you that sort of things about it. But as far as should you financially buy that car, I don't want to say, oh, yes, buy that car. And then after you buy the car, you're having a hard time making the payments. Okay? Then you come back and blame me. No, I don't want that. And so the person kept pushing me about, should I buy that car? Should I not? Should I? And I said, well, let me ask you this. 'Cause I said, I don't know why your finances or anything. I said, but I already knew that person was working 3 jobs trying to make ends meet. And so I said, I reminded them of that. I said, you know, you're working a lot. You have 3 jobs. And I said, I would just be careful that you're not biting off more than you can chew. You know. And so they said, okay. So they promptly went out that week and bought the car. I didn't say don't buy it. So in their defense. 2 weeks later, they got laid off from one of their jobs. And about 6 months later, they ended up having to sell the car, and they had to sell it for a loss. Okay? I didn't go back to them when they came into church on Sunday and said, see, I told you shouldn't have bought that car. You know? I still wanted them to come to church. You know. So our advice, we just need to be careful with our advice. Now, in verses 12 to 20, we have the plot to harm Joseph. In question number 9. Okay, the brothers took the flocks to Shechem, which is 20 miles away. All right, so now, you know, with sheep, you have to keep moving the sheep all the time. Sheep will eat the grass, and then they will pull the roots of the grass out, and then you just have dirt. So what they have to do is you have to keep moving the sheep along, so they don't destroy the land, and then you rotate around, and so they're at Shechem. It's 20 miles away. Now, this was, not sure about the wisdom of this for them either. A couple years before this, Simeon and Levi had devastated the town of Shechem. You remember the story how that one of the prominent men in the town, he wanted to marry Dinah, and he forced himself on her, and instead of them allowing them to be married, Simeon and Levi had told them, we can't do that because you're uncircumcised, and so the men all got circumcised, and then while they were sore, Simeon and Levi went in and massacred them. I don't think this was the smartest thing for them to move through that area. It wasn't really wise for them to do it, but they did. Jacob, justifiably so, he was concerned for them and their safety, and so he wanted to know how things were going, and so he sent Joseph to check on them. Go see how your brothers are doing. So in question number 10, by the time that Joseph arrived in Shechem, by the time he got there, the brothers had moved on to Dothan. Again, that was another 20 miles away, further away from where Jacob was. And so, Joseph is just going from place to place trying to find them. It says that when Joseph is looking for his brother, he asks someone where his brothers had gone. I think they went that way. And at one point it says a man found Joseph just out in the field wandering. Okay, how can I find them? And so when they saw Joseph coming afar off, they plotted against him. Here comes that dreamer. They hated him so bad. So they planned to kill him, and then they were going to hide his body after they killed him. And they would tell Jacob that a wild beast killed Joseph. So, if Jacob is 17, then that means that Reuben is 7 years older. He's 24. Okay? They're plotting this. Now, Reuben persuaded them to throw Joseph into a cistern. A cistern was a man-made well. They lined it with clay, and the water would collect, and when it rained, it would fill it up, and they would have water. And so this must have been dry. They threw him in there instead of killing him. Now, what are we going to do with him? Okay, so they hadn't killed him yet. Now, of course, if they left Joseph in that pit, in that cistern, eventually he's going to die. But Reuben, he planned to rescue Joseph later. Don't kill him. Put him in the pit. And so, now, for some reason, Joseph went off someplace, and when he came back, he was shocked to find Joseph gone. So he came back. They probably had put a stone across the mouth of the cistern. That was common in their days, and he must have been shocked to find Joseph gone. Imagine Joseph down in there in the dark. That must have been a little frightening. And especially now that he's hearing them, I can't imagine hearing somebody talking about killing you. That would have, especially your own brothers. Now I can see it. Them saying, "I'm going to kill you." Well, that might be just talk, but no, they're actually thinking about doing it. So a caravan, the Midianites, headed down to Egypt, passed by them as they're talking about this. So, now let's not kill him. So they sold him to the Midianites for 20 pieces of silver. Now, we see that Joseph is a picture of Jesus. And here, the life and trials of Joseph, how that Jesus suffered trials, and that Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, and Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. The difference being the price of a boy versus the price of a man. Now, Reuben was angry with them, okay? But it was done. Nothing they could do now. They're gone. He couldn't get him back. So now they had to continue with their deception. So they ripped up the coat, and they dipped it in goat's blood or sheep's blood. And then they took it back to Jacob and asked him, "Is this your son's coat?" Now, notice how they didn't lie. They didn't say, "We found Joseph's coat." What did they do? "Is this your son's coat?" Be like Robert. If I brought Ariana's leather jacket, all right? If I ripped up the leather jacket, "Robert, is this your daughter's jacket?" Okay, yeah, you're going to recognize it. Yeah, and Jacob was devastated to learn of Joseph's death. Now, we're talking about it here as if he had died. Okay, he hasn't. We know that he hasn't, but Jacob doesn't know that, and Jacob, for the next 13 to 15 years, Jacob is, next 20 years, he's going to think that his son is dead for the next 20 years. Joseph is sold into slavery. Joseph's dreams seem to be derailed. I mean, how in the world could he possibly lord over his brothers and his family if he's gone? How could they come true now? Now, there are two griefs that are happening now, father and son. And his brothers have to live with their actions. Okay. That was, for the next 20 years, they have to keep up to charade. Jacob refuses to be comforted. He says, you're going to take me to my grave. I'm going to bear this grief right to the grave. And then our final question. In Egypt, Joseph was sold to the captain of the palace guard. The prison guard, the head of the prison, he's going to, when he is thrown in prison, he's going to now become the head person underneath the head of the prison. So he is now sold to the captain of the palace guard, and that's Potiphar. It's difficult to see that God can bring good from this situation. But God's plan is still moving forward. There are still difficult days ahead for Joseph. At verse 37, it hints at the future of God's people, that God is going to do something, going to work a miracle for them. So we know what happened to them, but let us try to understand as we go through the next couple weeks' lessons what they were going through. Pretend that you don't know the rest of the story. Amen. That's our lesson for this morning. The story continues next week, and Robert will pass that out.